right. Good morning, everybody. We are still waiting for some handouts, but the printer was misbehaving. So those are coming. But the first thing on the handouts is also the first thing on the slide here. I just kind of wanted to open up with some questions and discussion about what we currently know and think about the story of Deborah in Judges 4 and 5. I'm very excited. This is kind of the lecture that I wanted to give. Fabulous. We do have handouts now, so yeah. Are they not? They were supposed to be double-sided, but the printer just was not having it today. So we'll have a 2-page handout. Yeah, this is kind of a lecture that kicked everything off. This is the reason why I wanted to talk about women in the Bible, and especially focusing on like women in authority and what those implications are for women in the church today. And so, yeah, when I know that growing up, I did not feel like we talked much about this story.
Thank you.
But I'm curious to know what your experience has been with Judges 4 and 5. So that first question, what have you been told about the story of Deborah generally?
She was a very important woman.
She was a very important woman.
And knew how to delegate and be different ways from rock.
That is such a positive way to describe it. I wish that more people would say that. She knew how to delegate.
Good morning. Did you understand my message about going back to the soundboard and all that stuff? Okay, thank you. I did put some extra bread on your plate because of that.
That's how it happens.
Very positive, you know, especially the share that made.
Right.
God and thank you for
Right. Right. Yeah. Wise, faithful. Those are great ways to describe her. Yeah. So combining that with question 2, like when we think about Deborah herself, like what have you let's think more about this. When we think about Deborah, what are other words that come to mind, either that you have sussed out from your own reading, or just kind of in general what your tradition, your pastor might have said?
Yeah, I always thought that Deborah gave us an example that women can be in leadership because God used her in leadership. And but I always was wondering about when Deborah told Barak to go out to battle, and he said, "I won't go out unless you come with me." I always wondered about that. He's the general. You know, why does he need her to come out?
That's a really good point. Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about that.
So I always wondered why he would insist on something like that. Did she have some kind of extra authority that he didn't have that he's going to need? It just didn't make any sense to me. I don't know. Was she a warrior judge? Was she a Gideon? I don't know. But I always wondered about that aspect of the story.
Those are all great questions, and I hope that I'm able to at least address all of them. So, yeah, and kind of go into the third question there. What have you been told about Barak?
That he was a coward.
He was a coward. Yeah, that's the prevailing, even from people who look at Deborah in a positive light, Barak's still a coward.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much down the line, just the way it's read. And there is like when people approach the biblical text, like, it's funny because it is an assumption that is so ingrained that even people who study the text for a living cannot get beyond the idea that there's a different option. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. And then in general, how have you heard Judges 4 and 5 used to argue for or against female leadership?
4.
You've heard it for 4. Has there been anybody who has heard it used against?
I've heard it with the caveat.
Yeah.
It's okay for a woman to lead only if a man can't or won't.
There we go.
And I've literally, in church, people have said that.
She's an exception.
Yeah.
She's the exception that proves the rule. So she's not to be emulated. She's someone who, we can gain a lot from the story, but good, heavens to Betsy, this is not something that is supposed to be for all women. That is how I grew up hearing about it, but I admit, in general, I feel like I didn't grow up hearing about it. You've got a couple different options here, and I think that the tradition that I grew up in, it was kind of like, well, let's just forget about her. Let's just not talk about this at all. And so I just grew up assuming that, there's lots of stories in the Bible that we don't generally talk about. I mean, Ehud, right before this, we don't talk a lot about him killing the king on the toilet. But, I thought, we just don't talk about every story in the Bible. And then I also just kind of assumed that, well, maybe they're right. Maybe the reason we don't talk about this is because there's something underlying all this that is, less kosher than we want. I was raised with these assumptions that, it was because Deborah was the leader because there was no other man to lead. And I also feel like, kind of like what we talked about, how we gain personality traits. Like we pick up ideas about the personalities of these characters from artwork and stuff like that. One for Deborah was like, there was kind of a haughtiness to her, and ironically, that's actually kind of like especially in Jewish tradition, the idea that Deborah was haughty is a really big thing. So between Christian and Jewish interpreters, you find that Jewish interpreters recognize her authority, but they paint her as somebody who isn't to be emulated because they see haughtiness, especially in Judges 5, the Song of Deborah, and that she was there's even a myth that got attached to the story that she loses her prophetic powers, which again is not in the text at all. But it was a way that they had to kind of diminish her. And on the Christian side, instead of recognizing her authority, they'll actually overemphasize her personality and all. She's sweet and kind and motherly and nurturing and all of these things. But it's the office that she holds that's not to be emulated. So, good Christian women, you can all take something from Deborah to your role as housewife and mother. And so it's just really interesting. I don't want to spend a ton of time on the history of interpretation, but we inherit so much, just like we inherit so much when we talked about Eve. And so this is, again, just kind of trying to let Deborah speak for herself, let the text speak for itself, and see if we can't draw out some ideas from the language and culture that help us to approach this text a little bit more faithfully. So let's get started. Again, this was something that I just kind of wanted to point to, this idea of Deborah being forgotten. This is John MacArthur's well-known 12 Extraordinary Women of the Bible book. And who is not on there? Deborah. Who else is not on there? JL. Esther. Priscilla. Phoebe. So this is kind of the tradition I was raised in. And I'm grateful to be in a church now where when I ask the question, how have you heard this text be used to argue for or against women? I'm grateful that the prevailing overarching response was not, it was used against women. That's a big deal for me. So like I said, I've got a real personal connection to this story. This is not something that I thought a lot about when I was younger. But then about this time last year, I work at Tyndale House Publishers, and we acquired Rose Publishers. They put out lots of really great Bible resources that are very highly illustrated, really great for just people in general. And I was reading through this new book that we were publishing called Women in the Old Testament. And it just floored me when I got to the part about Deborah. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. But we know that in the text, or in our English biblical translations, it says Deborah, prophetess, wife of Lapidoth. And then I found out, wife of Lapidoth does not have to be translated that way. It could also be used to mean woman of fire. And when I heard that, it was like, okay, that's not a given. I'm not arguing that it's a given. But it was the thing that got me thinking, if that is how it ought to be translated, and it is actually translated that way throughout Jewish tradition a lot more than Christian. But if it is, then this is a woman who subverts so many expectations in terms of leadership, in terms of office, in terms of just like her role in the community, being a prophet in a world where, you know, the religious institution of the time was the priests in the tabernacle, and it just really floored me that I had never heard that before. And it just really kind of set me off on all of this exploration, which is why I'm here today. So that's really where we're coming from. I love to talk about kind of like what we inherit in terms of the artwork. You know, like I did that a little bit with Eve. We can't really do that much with Deborah because there aren't a lot of famous pictures, like, you know, images of her. And even the ones that we have, like, they don't really make a mark as much on our collective mental impression of her. But like, this is a woodcut that was made for a Bible in the 1800s, you know, really emphasizing her role as prophet. You know, you can just kind of get that idea of like a very charismatic woman. You know, she's pointing to God. All of the men around her listening intently, but you can see how it's emphasizing one facet of what we see in her. The first image of Deborah that we had until recently was this one from an illuminated medieval manuscript. And so obviously you can see that in the style of artwork, but it's Deborah and Barak going to war. But 3 years ago, we found some images of this story that predate this image by about 1,000 years. And this is why, again, I emphasize a lot how much we learn from archaeology, we learn from, you know, just like we're getting new information all of the time from historians and biblical scholars, and it's amazing that, you know, we have to look at this and go, we have to hold that tension between, like, the Word of God never changes, but our understanding certainly does, including things like this. So we go from illuminated manuscript from the Middle Ages to mosaic dating from 400 BC. Like I said, this was... AD or BC? Sorry, AD. So like I said, about 1,000 years beforehand. And this, like I said, this one only discovered, I think, 2 or 3 years ago.
Is that jail?
Yes, so it's kind of cool. There's obviously more of this mosaic that was broken. But what we have, we have all 4 of our protagonists rendered in these 2 different, originally it was a 3-part story with 3 different images. The one, I wish I had like a little pointer. You see right at the very tippy top, there's like a little foot. Mm-hmm. There were 3 registers originally, but just over the course of time, things get damaged. All we have left is we have the first register, which is Deborah and Barak, her under her palm tree, and commissioning him to go to battle. And then the final register, which is Jael and Sisera, the general, and her driving a tent peg through his head. So we're going to talk about more about this story in detail, but one thing that was so fascinating, again, like what we're learning things all the time. We've never seen images like this. The rest of the mosaic images are all about male protagonists in the Bible, and the director who was in charge of overseeing this excavation, she talks a lot about how this is such a unique thing, but we can ask ourselves, like, what did this mean to the people living in this village in the Lower Galilee, which is actually very geographically near where the story of Deborah and Barak would have happened. And the one thing that this director mentions is that 400 AD, the Jewish people were now living under Roman rule. And to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the emperors commissioned coins like this. It says, Judea capta, the capture of Jerusalem, and it's a female figure that kind of stands in for Israel as a whole, weeping beneath a palm tree. And so, of course, she thinks, was this an image that they sought out, that they wanted included in these mosaics? Because that took on the idea of Israel being led by a woman, an independent woman, that meant something different to them then. And yeah, I just think that that's so fascinating and just wonderful things to find.
Is this a Jewish or a Christian image, or Jewish?
Jewish. It's
Not Christian.
Not Christian. No.
But did Jewish people make mosaics? I mean, obviously they did. They made this one, but like, is that very common because they were like anti-images, or were they not?
They weren't
They're just
anti-images.
Anti-images of God.
Yeah, anti-images of God. Yeah, they're not terribly.
Okay.
As far as I'm aware, and I'm not an expert
Yeah.
by any means, but I don't think that we have the same kind of prohibition that we get through things like like Islamic tradition.
I'm just wondering because like in what kind of a setting was it? Like in a home or in a palace or in a synagogue?
I believe in a synagogue. I believe. Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was just going to add those coins. I think they minted those for about 25 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, and this was like central to the whole like legitimation of the new Roman dynasty after the destruction of the temple. They're like basically we are legitimate rulers because we just destroyed the Jews. This was like central to their whole narrative of who they were.
And so so interesting. This is a couple centuries later, but like maybe it was still something that was in their memory. And if it does, and these are assumptions, but they're not unfounded assumptions. To be able to say like, is this the Jewish people trying to wrestle through what their identity is now?
Yeah.
Like it's just fascinating. So,
And with the supposedly Christian empire at that point.
yeah. So I really do like to treat this story as this is such a great dramatic story. I mean, if you've grown up watching movies like The Ten Commandments and The Prince of Egypt, about the Exodus, this is something that I just feel like follows right in that same tradition. It's such a great dramatic story. If anybody has any connections to Hollywood, I have a screenplay for this story that I would love to see made into a movie. So, our cast of characters here, we'll just, kind of give an overview here. And then what I do kind of just want to do today is we're going to have a little bit of an overview, but then I just want to read through Judges 4. Because sometimes I think we need to just kind of re-celebrate this story simply by hearing it, because we don't hear it a lot. And hopefully when we do that, we will hear it with new ears after we give a little bit of an introduction. So, our cast of characters, and you'll find this on your handout as well. We've got Jabin, the king of Canaan, who ruled from Hatzor, so you can see that's right up here. Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, which possessed 900 iron chariots. That's probably more like wooden chariots that were then gilded with iron. We're at the start of the Iron Age, but still, the text makes it very clear that the size of this iron chariot army is decimating Israel. Even before this chapter, it's also mentioned. They're also mentioned in Judges 1 or 2, I believe. And then we have Deborah, a prophetess, Ishet Lapidot, which that's the phrase that kind of started this whole thing. That it can be translated as, so Ishet is related to Isha. We talked about that in Genesis 1 and 2. The idea that's just woman, but it also means wife in context. So it can be translated either as wife of Lapidoth, but Lapidoth is a name that is not corroborated anywhere else. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not a name, because we have a lot of things that are not corroborated by other sources. But it does seem like Lapidoth is probably a feminine Canaanite word meaning torches, which just kind of makes you go, is that a name that someone would have given their Israelite child? Not really sure. But if it's woman of torches, then essentially you can go with that to a lot of places. The Jewish sages and rabbis they emphasize this idea that Deborah was a woman of torches. They kind of invent this fan fiction, essentially, that she was responsible for creating wicks for the tabernacle. So even there you can see, that's not in the biblical text, but it does make you ask, is this something related to vocation in a way that we haven't assumed before. But you can really make it a personality statement as well. You know, a woman of torches, a woman of flames. She's a fiery woman, and we see that in the text. So, do I think that our English translation should reflect that? I at least think it should be an alternative translation listed at the bottom. So, and then we have our male protagonist, Barak ben Anuam, an Israelite military commander living in Kadesh. So you can see that Kadesh is close to Hatzor, so that's where, you know, King Jabin is ruling. Barak is beyond that. Deborah was not in this region. She was she judged Israel from her seat between Ramah and Bethel, and that didn't make it on the map here, but it's just below Manasseh here. Below that is the territory of Ephraim. And so the text says between Ramah and Bethel, which is, again, a really interesting point, because we can assume that the tabernacle was, and the Ark of the Covenant was probably in Bethel at this time. It later gets moved to Shiloh. But if she is near Bethel, did she seek out that place to be near the tabernacle? Was she not allowed to be in Bethel proper? It's really hard to know. But all we know is that we see this woman essentially set up shop beneath a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel. And then later on in the story, we have Heber the Kenite. The Kenites were a tribe that draw their, they see themselves as descended from the father-in-law of Moses. So we also call him Jethro. But so not Israelite, but also kind of a half sibling, I guess. And he's an ally of King Jabin, but living away from his tribe. On this map, it shows his location a little bit further south. I've also seen it like even further north than Hatzor, but that geography will kind of be important later on in the story. Notably, Sisera is originally from Harosheth Hagoyim, and then we also see that we have his mother, who is not in Judges 4, but is given a literary painting in Judges 5, is also located in Harosheth Hagoyim. And then, of course, we also have Jael, who's kind of the one who doesn't appear until very late in the story, but also becomes very important to it. She's the wife of Heber, who's living near him, or living with him near Zanaim. All right, so a couple of things before we tackle this story that kind of should give us a little bit more context. The book of Judges is in quotes. Shofet does not mean judge in a modern judicial sense. So, no. I didn't want that to animate on every single slide. Sefer Shofetim is the name of the book, but this is problematic because when you study the cognates of the Hebrew root in the other ancient Near Eastern societies, we find that it doesn't really have a primary judicial connotation. Instead, it means to issue orders, to exercise authority, to rule, to govern, to administer. So one name for it could be the Book of Governors. That's, I think, a really good option, and if we weren't so married to tradition, I think that most people agree that that's what it should be. I don't think that you will see any English translation ever changing it. The word is also used in reference to specifically these military deliverers who rescue Israel from oppression. So that's a little bit interesting too, because the word means one thing. We don't really see these people acting in a political manner so much. Like it's usually like the book of Judges says that God raised up judges specifically to liberate Israel in these moments of oppression. And so this is controversial. I don't expect this ever to be translated this way, but it also, in that context, could be better thought of as the book of saviors. I use this lowercase s, so we're not super uncomfortable. But again, like it kind of gets at this idea of like, what's going on here? Who are these people? What are they doing? It is really complicated to try to draw out even like implications for women in general in this story when we can't even really figure out what it's meant originally. So the other caveat here is that in the book of Judges, there's not a single protagonist in the book that is called a shofet, meaning judge. The author uses the verbal form of the root, telling us that Othniel governed Israel or judged Israel, as did Deborah, as did Jephthah, as did Samson. So what do we do with that? We can't even really ascribe the word judge or governor to any of these people, and that's in the text. And the irony here is that there's one glaring exception to all of this, which seems to kind of prove that point, which is that in 11:27, God is called the Lord the Judge. So keep that in mind too as we're talking about these stories of governors or these stories of saviors, whether or not there could be deeper messages that are supposed to be coming through about, well, actually God is the judge.
Well, you also have a big contrast between Deborah and Samson.
You have a big contrast between Deborah and all of the other judges. So
Well, I mean, Samson is really kind of by himself.
I mean, he is, but he doesn't make a promise to
But then
kill
we
his
have
only
all
daughter.
the stories. We have most details about him.
Yes, we have a lot of details about Samson. There are some, kind of minor judges and some judges that get a lot more content. But that is something that I think is really important. I mean, we've got, even somebody like we typically look at it like the judges at the start of the book are better than the ones later on. But even then, we have this real glorification of violence. There are judges who, you just look at some of the things that they do, even when they're portrayed as more positive, they're doing really, I don't know, they're doing things that I don't think that we can say, oh, they're doing violence, thus they're bad, because that can't even apply to the book of Deborah.
Not adhering to the Geneva Convention.
Yeah, but it does make you question, even the good judges, you just wonder where God is and what he wants them to be doing. Deborah is so strange because there's no criticism of her in any part of the story. There is not a single moment where she is excused, justified, explained away, and there's not a single moment, unlike most of the other judges, where the text focuses on something that she did wrong or a personality trait that was bad. All that was added by other people wanting to just diminish her. But it is, so interesting to look at her in comparison to Gideon and Ehud and all of these other people.
Do you think that the point of Deborah is partly just that Barak was not very brave?
We will get to that.
Yeah.
So, yes. So who was Deborah? We are told that she is a prophetess, or literally just a woman prophet. That's probably a better way to look at it, because the prophetess, I think that especially in our modern sense, we think that it must convey something different. And it doesn't. It's literally just a woman prophet. So she's following in the tradition of Miriam in Exodus, and then after her will come other figures like Huldah, who we don't talk a lot about, but in the reign of Josiah, after the Book of the Laws are discovered, she's the one who sought out to determine what this means and whether they're authentic. Noadia is a hard one because she's listed in the scriptures as being a false prophetess. So she's in there, the term is applied to her, but also has to have caveats related to that. And then there's also a reference to the prophetess in Isaiah. And then in the New Testament, we also get figures like Anna, we get the daughters of Philip. It's hard because there are a number, Deborah is not in a class of her own, but at the same time, these aren't women we're spending a ton of time talking about or thinking about. But I did want to mention as well, prophecy in general, one thing that kind of trips us up a lot is that it's much less about telling the future, though in a story even like Deborah's, we will see that as well. But it's much more about the idea that prophets are receiving messages from God. They are a mouthpiece for God on behalf of the people. So like, they're delivering the messages, and so like, I think that's just really important because we think about like divination and future telling, and that was actually a really big part of other cultures surrounding Israel at this time, and yet things like divination are explicitly forbidden for Israelites. And so it's much better to think about this idea of prophecy as being, like forth tellers of the message of God as opposed to future telling. So she was a prophetess, and then I used this phrase, like, I didn't say she was a judge, Shofet, judge, but the phrase who was judging Israel. That's the way it is used for all of these judges, so that's the way I put it down here. Ishet Lapidoth, we've already talked about this, the wife of Lapidoth, or woman of fire, woman of flames, could also be woman of Lapidoth, which could be a place name. So there's just a lot of options here. And then she was also a bee, in that the word Deborah is the Hebrew word for bee. And this is not in the biblical text. It is first, I'm not sure if it was first included in the works of Josephus, but he's definitely the one who like establishes it so that like literally every biblical commentator will then draw on the fact that her name means bee. And so this is where we get into the idea of, Jewish as well, Jewish and Christian allegory. We draw out so much about what it means that Deborah was a bee. So tell me about bees.
They pollinate.
They pollinate. What do we say over here?
Sting.
They sting. They so there were.
Dangerous.
We fear them.
We fear them. How about what do they make?
Honey.
So they're also sweet. So you get all these things, but like you will see a lot of Christian commentators who draw out this idea that like, as we allegorize Deborah in a Christological fashion, we need to remember that the word of God is both sweet but also has a sting, and like all of these things. And it's like, okay, it's kind of like when I put up those social media posts the last time about like, how Eve being created of Adam's rib, like, she's cherished and everything. It's like all of these thoughts are things that are like, they're not bad thoughts. Yes, we should think about the ways in which the word of God is sweet, but also something that we can look at as having a sting that holds us to account. But the point is that it's not in the biblical text. And the irony is that I think a much better understanding of her name is that it probably originates from the Hebrew word dbr, debir, which is the verb to speak, because her name, Deborah, essentially translates into she speaks, which I think is a much better meaning of her name. But like I said, like this is the kind of stuff that we inherit that just keeps getting passed down. And it's only when we go back and look at the language that we can kind of resituate ourselves and ask, what is actually in the text? What are we supposed to be taking from this? So who was Barak? And who was Barak to Deborah? His name, again, kind of furthered by Josephus, means lightning. Okay, so his name means lightning. Remember that we've got this other mention of this other person who never appears in the text named Lapidoth, and his name means torches, or fire, or flame. So, especially in the Middle Ages, it becomes so prevalent to say that Barak and Lapidoth are the same person. So then Lapidoth becomes Barak and Deborah are married. Well, now we've got, this reference to this woman who she's married, the commands that she's, everything that she's doing, like she's commanding her husband, but it also raises him up so that he's essentially a co-judge with her. And again, you just kind of see how like all of this gets added to the text. It's not in there. It's not convincing. I don't think that this is right at all. But I also think that it nobody ever talks about this, but I also just kind of think that points to this instinct that we have to kind of take our female protagonist and our male protagonist and smash them together. But that's not in the text either. But if we elevate Barak to the husband of Deborah, then there is something there that was drawn out, this idea that he could have been like a co-judge. And that is actually something that you can find in the text it'd be implicit. But there's a great article that really kind of turned my understanding of the story on its head, which is always fun but always inconvenient, that Dr. Daniel Block wrote a couple of years ago in the Biblical Archaeology Review. And he draws out the fact that, like, this story is different from the other stories of the judges in that the beginning of Judges, it says God raised up judges to liberate Israel, essentially. And that phrasing, God raised up, is found in most of the other stories of the judges, except for Deborah's. And so then Dr. Block uses that to kind of think, well, what if it's not Deborah being raised up? What if it's Barak through Deborah? And so it's essentially that the narrative itself has a more expounded upon, whereas you see the phrase, God raised up a certain judge, that Deborah's story actually is a little bit more expounded upon. I think that it's definitely something that you can run with, especially because the subversion of the idea of, like, well, if Deborah's not the judge, but she was judging Israel, if Barak is not the judge because he's told that he won't be given glory and honor, if Jael, who is kind of the unexpected protagonist in this story, is not a judge, then who's the judge? Well, I showed you the one glaring exception to the rule about who's called judge in this book, and it's God. I'm not saying that this applies to every single narrative, but in isolation, I do think that you can really make the point that, like, the protagonist of the story is God. And there's no better way to see that than in Deborah and Jael and Barak, who is a military commander who doesn't get the glory in the end. But to be able to end it and say, this story is meant to be subversive, but it's subversive in the way that it says these are faithful people who show that God is the protagonist of the whole story. I think that that's really powerful, but I also think that that it's just an idea of, like, how to interpret the story in a way that's different, but also has a lot of implications. So,
do you think there's any significance that, like, in 4:4 it says she was judging Israel at that time? So it's not so much like God raises her up to begin to judge in response to the cry of the people, but it's more like the cry of the people comes and the story kind of plays out differently because she was already judging. It's more like background information, almost, than kind of a new thing happening in response to the cry.
Ironically, I don't see a lot of people thinking about that. I think that, like, I am exceptionally interested in the first part of the story. Like everybody always focuses on the military conquests and stuff like that. And I'm very interested in the fact that, like, she was already judging Israel. So, like, what was going on during those 20 years of oppression that led to her being in that place? Dr. Block does emphasize the idea that, like, because this verb, like, to judge, is best understood in terms of these military deliverers, it might be better to think that, like, she was judging Israel as more of, like, people were coming to her asking what we should do about this political situation. And so her judgment is more specifically about, like, when and how they should respond. But yeah, I think that that's a really great insight. So,
I think in Judges 4, in verse 6, Deborah calls Barak in and says, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you." She was speaking on behalf of God.
Yeah. And
These
so
weren't just her words. She was in that position of leadership, and God used her to direct Barak.
And that's so important because she is the only judge who is also called a prophet. And that is not something that can be, should be nuanced in any way. Like, that is something that is explicitly unique about her. And a lot of people have tried to allegorize even that in terms of like, oh, well, God gave her the office of prophetess because she was a woman, because she was the weaker sex, so that people wouldn't question her authority. And I mean, I guess I'm not even going to deny that, like, maybe that could be something God had done. But I also think that, like, if we just take the text, like, there is no questioning of her. There's nothing in the text that says she was respected because she was a prophet. She's just a woman in power, and they're respecting her. And I think that that's really important to just kind of proclaim that. So,
Wasn't Samuel a judge and a prophet?
no, I don't believe a prophet.
Samuel?
Oh, yeah, but in Judges.
Oh,
in Judges,
in the book
of
of
Judges.
Samuel himself
Yes, I
was
believe-
also a judge and
Yes.
a prophet, right?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
He was much better than most of the others.
Yes. But let's get to the crux of the matter. I think that this is one that, like, is just really important. I have not seen a lot of people look at this. This is literally from a footnote in one of Dr. John Walton's books, The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest. And I'm just waiting for him to write a book on this instead of just relegating this to a footnote, because I've never really seen people pick up on this. But was Barak a coward? So in Judges 4, it says, "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah, "but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. Many interpreters assume that Barak is wishing for Deborah's company as a sign of weakness and cowardice, for which he is punished by being denied the glory of killing Sisera. So the gloss would be, if you had gone by yourself, you would have had victory and glory, but now the glory will go to someone else. But the construction translated "but not," so when we see "but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours," it's not an admonition. It's used to soften the implications of a preceding statement. So Dr. Walton gives two different examples. In Deuteronomy 15, God commands the canceling of debts, which obviously would be a financially catastrophic event for the lender, but then softens it immediately by promising that the Lord's blessing will make everyone wealthy enough that it won't matter. In Amos 9:8, God threatens to destroy Israel from the face of the earth, but then softens it immediately by adding "yet not totally destroy." The construction translated "but, yet, or however," when not combined with a negation, does harden the previous statement. So we see that in something like for 2 Samuel, where talking to David, the Lord says, "You are not going to die, but the son born to you will die." So then, the implication then, the phrase, "I, Deborah, will go with you," means Yahweh will go with you as you go on your way. The full implications of divine assistance, which are normally victory and glory, are softened by the qualification, "but the honor will not be yours." This is simply a condition of divine favor. If Barak had gone alone, he would have had neither glory nor victory. So I know that kind of like is a twisting logic, but I think that what's really important here is the idea that if we're assuming Barak is coming and saying this because he's a coward, then we only have one reading. But turn it around and say, Barak recognizes who Deborah is. Barak recognizes that the Spirit of God is on Deborah. Remember that this is not, that this is Old Testament, when the idea of the Holy Spirit is more about resting on individual people. It's not, a communal thing. Barak goes to her and he says, "Come with me, you have the Lord with you." And Deborah says, essentially, "I will go with you." And then, yes, the very next line is related to this idea that you're not going to have glory, but it's not really a cause and effect. It's actually, this is just like how God is playing out this story. And I think that it kind of goes back to what I said before about this is a story where you see three unlikely protagonists, none of whom are actually given the glory in the end, because the point is that it's God's work. So does that kind of, any thoughts?
Isn't there something about Moses? God says, I'm done with you, and you're running Moses. Hey, God, if you don't go with this, I'm not going to do this.
Yeah, in terms of him at the burning bush.
I can't do this without you.
No, this was after the incident, I think, of the calf, the golden calf.
Yeah.
God's voice
Oh.
said to the people, and he said, "Go, but I'm not going to go with you." And Moses says, "I won't go if you don't."
Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. Yeah, I haven't seen that applied to this chapter in kind of a parallel, but that's...
But it's a little bit like he's saying, hey, God's with you. And if you don't come, then I don't have God on my side.
Exactly. I think that that's him recognizing that. And one thing that really surprised me when I first started thinking about all of this, I was talking about this with my community group, and I was amazed that like Ben Franklin, who grew up in a much more Pentecostal, charismatic denomination, was like, yeah, that's what we were all taught. There was no sense that Barak is a coward. It's that he's recognizing who Deborah is and that the Spirit of God rests upon her. So I think that like when it completely changes the way that you look at this. So in our last couple minutes, this shouldn't take too long, but I just wanted to read through Judges 4.
Well, before you do that, I think it's interesting that the comment is, I'll go with you, but God will deliver it into the hands of the Lord.
Yes.
And when I got to that point, I expected it to be Deborah.
Of course.
So
That's why I love this story, because it's so dramatic in a way that like I read a lot of ancient texts, and there are a lot of times when like you get to the end of a story and you're like, that's not really as powerful as it might have been in a modern story, telling of a story. But like this one, it's just like it's got such drama, and it's got such like irony and just this beautiful picture of like what I believe it's showing who God is, and I don't know. That's why I just want this to be a movie, and I don't know why it hasn't been. So I've got some nice pictures here, but let's just listen to the words of Judges 4, and with these new thoughts in mind, think about like the implications that people have used in the past and what we might want to think, how we might want to think differently in the future. So I'm reading from the NIV. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold him into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried out to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. Again, that translation is probably not great because there's not really a sense of judicial review going on here, but that's the way they translated it. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you. Go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands." Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah. "But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. Now Heber the... Oh, sorry. That's them talking. There we go. Now Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, or father-in-law, I'm not sure, and pitched his tent near the great tree of Zanaim near Kadesh. No, there's the battle. When they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera summoned from Harosheth Hagoyim in the Kishon River all of his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So Barak went down Mount Tabor, with 10,000 men following him. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hatzor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. The implication that if you look at your map, he flees in the entirely opposite direction, which is, you want to talk about who's the coward of this story. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in, don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Just then Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. Your homework going forward is to also read Judges 5, because that's where we get the beautiful song. If you've ever seen The Prince of Egypt, they've got a wonderful song as they, lead out of the city, and Miriam is, biblically the one who's leading that. And it's just amazing to me that this follows so closely in that tradition of a female prophet, female leader who is leading the Israelites in song, and it's just beautiful. But
You call it the Song of Deborah, but it says on that day, Deborah and Barak, the Song of
it's a duet.
song.
It's a duet. And I mean,
She can't get all the credit.
I can't get all the credit. Actually, people, a lot of commenters do talk about that, it's listed as Deborah and Barak because they're both listed in their alliance. They're wake up Deborah, arise Barak. It's clearly this back and forth and the implication is that it's a communal thing as well.
It's ridiculous from in our hymns, the guys just go da da da, and the women go up and down.
Yeah.
Isn't this one of the oldest, super old, things
Super
that got
interesting.
passed down, this song?
Yeah, it's super interesting because, again, textual criticism, it's a hard subject, but, Judges 5 is written in this archaic Hebrew that is very difficult to translate, but it is likely one of the oldest passages in the Bible. Fascinating. So, but what I love is that it really, Judges 5 is so poetic. I mentioned that Sisera's mother is a character in this, and she's in Judges 5, and fascinating as well. It's Deborah thinking about this image of Sisera's mother in her palace in Harshath Havoim, and thinking about when is my son returning. She's anticipating that he's going to return in victory with captives and female captives for every man, and all of this plunder, and this image. She's not. We don't hear from her point of view, but it's just a really fascinating look into the way that these cultures are kind of interacting one with another. So I don't know. Like I said, I would really love to have a movie about this because I think that she's been so forgotten, and I don't want to write a book. I don't want to write an article. I want a movie because there's something about movies that can't be ignored, especially if they're big. And I just want John MacArthur and all of these people who have decided, we're just not going to think about her. I want them to have to grapple with the fact that this is the story. And they can say whatever they want. I can't change that. But I'm tired of them getting off on this idea that we can just ignore her and it doesn't really matter. And right now, it feels like nobody's called them on it. So that's my dream. Maybe someday it'll be a reality. But thank you for celebrating this story with me today.
Thanks, Jessica.